To chapter 8 here. We're at the halfway point of this Gospel of Mark. And so if you've got some friends in your life, some neighbors, some people that you want to bring in here at the tail end, we're getting to the good stuff, the resurrection, all that's coming. If you want to bring them in for the good news part, I hope you'll invite them out sometime. But remember 2 weeks ago, if you were here when we were doing Mark chapter 7, I mentioned that this chapter that we're going to look at today is really kind of the turning point of the story. So hopefully you'll kind of see, if you've been reading at home or if you have been able to come each week, you'll see that the first half, really kind of all the way up to chapter 8, is kind of establishing really who Jesus is and what this ministry is going to be about. And then we have this turning point that we'll see here in chapter 8. And from here on in, everything is really moving pretty intentionally towards the cross. So we've kind of gotten an idea of who Jesus is, what he's about, what he's trying to do. And now we're going to see things kind of shift in the direction towards Jerusalem and that Passion Week and the crucifixion. So we've got 4 sections that we're going to look at today, and I hope that you brought a Bible or you can follow along here on the half sheet of paper if you like. The first section we're looking at is verses 1 through 10. I'll read those real quick for you, for those who don't have the scripture in front of you. This is chapter 8, verse 1 through 10. In those days, there was another large crowd with nothing to eat. Jesus called his disciples and told them, "I feel sorry for the crowd because they've been with me for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they won't have enough strength to travel, for some have come a long distance." His disciples responded, "How can anyone get enough food in this wilderness to satisfy these people?" Jesus asked, "How much bread do you have?" They said, 7 loaves. So he told the crowd to sit on the ground. He took the 7 loaves, gave thanks, broke them apart, and gave them to his disciples to distribute. And they gave the bread to the crowd. They also had a few fish. He said a blessing over them, then gave them to the disciples to hand out also. They ate until they were full. They collected 7 baskets full of leftovers. This was a crowd of about 4,000 people. Jesus sent them away, then got into a boat with his disciples and went over to the region of Dalmanutha. So, like I said, if you've been reading at home, if you've been able to come each week, this first scene here should sound pretty familiar, right? Kind of like a deja vu, like a glitch in the matrix here. Why are we doing this thing again? Didn't we just have this kind of miracle feeding a couple chapters ago? Yes, we did. And so that might cause you to pause and wonder, why is Mark doing this when he's got such a short time to kind of tell this story? Why is he telling us basically the same details over again? Well, there's a couple of differences just to kind of point out, and we're going to look at one a little bit later. One is the numbers, right? The first one was the feeding of the 5,000. This is the feeding of the 4,000. Different number of loaves, different number of basketfuls at the end. We're going to talk a little bit in a second about what might that mean. But the main thing to realize here, what's going on, is the first feeding of the 5,000 was on one side of the lake in Israel territory, Jewish territory. He was with his people, right? It was the Hebrew people, the Israelites, the Jews who had come and gathered around Jesus, who were fed in the wilderness that first time. And that would have been kind of an obvious echo to, remember, a lot of what Jesus is doing, we talked about this in Mark chapter 1 and a couple other places, a lot of what Jesus is doing is he's kind of recreating, breathing new life into the story that has formed who these people are throughout their lives. So can anybody think of another time in the history of the Israelite people where they were in the wilderness and they were hungry and didn't have anything to eat and food was provided? Anybody? Exodus, yeah. Manna from heaven, right? So this would have been a pretty clear, this is kind of what Mark is saying is, hey, remember that time when the people were set free, but they didn't quite really understand yet that they were free and they were wandering in the wilderness and they had nothing to eat, and God provided food for them? That's what Jesus is doing. So what's important about the feeding of the 4,000? He's on the other side of the lake this time. And we've seen this happen a few times, right? We've kind of seen, if you've been paying attention, Mark has kind of these 2 narratives going on, and they all get broken up by, then Jesus went to the other side of the lake. And you got to kind of keep up with where Jesus is to understand what's going on. This feeding is happening on the non-Jewish side of the lake, right? So that would have been pretty remarkable because the Jewish people would have had in their minds, okay, this guy is here for us, We're God's people. We're the special ones. He's feeding us. God's doing this again. But Jesus is really trying to drive this point home, right? That I'm not just here for this small nation of Israel. I'm here for the entire world. That's what this story is supposed to have been about the whole time. That's what God spoke to your father Abraham, was not just that you will be blessed. You will be blessed so that you can be a blessing to all nations. So Jesus is now in the wilderness with the non-believers, the heathens, the Gentiles. He's with us, and he's doing the same thing. He's saying, the wilderness, we're there. All of God's people are in the wilderness, and God feeds them. Okay? So this is a message he's been trying to drive home. He's trying to say, this is not just a Jewish mission. This is not just a Jewish ministry. This is not just a Jewish God. This is the God of the whole earth, the whole world, and I'm feeding them as well. Okay? So that's kind of the main thing to kind of point out. Remember, we just followed this story with the Syrophoenician woman who had that argument with Jesus, and Jesus said, I'm here for the Israelites, I'm here for the Hebrews, and she said, don't the dogs under the table get the crumbs? Well, now we get to see what the crumbs look like. The crumbs look just as generous and abundant as the stuff on the table for God's people, right? It's all the same. That's what Jesus is doing here. So, we have this feeding of the 4,000. And again, we'll talk about the numbers here in a second because Jesus goes into it later in the story. Goes back over the sea of Galilee. Who's waiting for him there? His best friends, right? The Pharisees. They can't wait to see him coming home, and they've put together this huge banquet right? Look at verse 11. The Pharisees showed up. He gets to the other side of the lake. They showed up and began to argue with Jesus. You ever had that experience before? You come from doing something, you walk in, you see some people you're not super excited about seeing, and they're not there to welcome you or to bid you good tidings. They're just there to start an argument. Well, what does Jesus do? He basically just gets back in the boat and says, to hell with you guys. I'm going to go back to the other side of the sea. Things were good there. People liked me. That's really kind of what happens. Jesus shows up. The Pharisees argue with him. They ask him a question. They say, we want to see a sign. Jesus says, this evil generation gets no sign. I'll see you guys later. I'm out of here. Gets back in the boat, goes to the other side. Well, it's a really brief little piece here, right? Verses 11 through 13 or whatever. And what is going on there? The Pharisees are asking for a sign. This is also kind of something that has happened before from this main narrative story that forms the Jewish people, right? Who else was looking for signs to understand that God was really God? Pharaoh. You remember this? Remember the 10 plagues? In the actual Hebrew, they're called the 10 signs. Not the 10 plagues, it's the 10 signs. And you had this character who represented everything that was opposed to God, who no matter how many things Moses did, kept saying, well, you got to prove to me that this God really is who you say he is. You need to really show me something here, right? This is like, I don't know if anybody has seen Monty Python's Life of Brian. This is what came to mind when I was reading the story. They're sitting in the arena and they're talking about how terrible the Romans are. What have the Romans ever done for us? And then they start going, well, I mean, there's medicine and education, sanitation, roads, irrigation, public health care, wine, public order. And they're like, yeah, but besides all of that, what have the Romans done for us, right? This is, I think, kind of what's going on here. The Pharisees are like, yeah, we've seen you cast out demons and heal the paralyzed and walk on water and feed people in the desert and all. Yeah, but we want to see a sign that you really are who you say you are. Come on, show us what you got. This is basically Jesus' way of saying, your hearts are hardened, right? This was Pharaoh's problem. This was the problem of the wanderers in the wilderness who saw Moses part the Red Sea and saw all of these miracles happen in Egypt, and they're out there in the desert with God as a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire, and they're complaining that God's not really God because they're hungry, because they're not getting what they want. Show us a sign. Moses, give us a sign. And Moses is like, are you guys kidding me? Have you not been paying attention? And this is what Jesus is doing here. He's kind of taking these Pharisees and he's saying, you're in the same camp as Pharaoh. Your hearts are hardened. It doesn't matter what I do. You're not going to see what and I wonder if anybody in here, think about if you've ever asked God for a sign. I think we probably all have, right? We've all had those moments where we're doubting and we ask God, just show me, God, that you really are who you say you are. We've pretty much closed our eyes to all the miracles that God has done in our life up to that point, right? I've done the same thing, right? We look backwards and we have these moments, we experience these things that we can't explain, and we say, this must be God, and it's a powerful, transformative moment for us, and then a week later, we've forgotten. We have what I like to call, we have miracle memory loss. That's one of the biggest problems of God's people, right? God does things in our lives that assure us of his presence, and in those moments, we are just so convinced that God is with me. God is near. God is who God says God is. And then a week later, something bad's going on in our life, and we're not so sure, and we're like, God, you got to give me a sign. You got to show me something. And a lot of times what we're looking for is not a sign. We're looking for God to do exactly what we want God to do, right? And that's what the Pharisees are looking for. That's what Pharaoh was looking for. That's what everybody who has seen God work and still doesn't believe. They're stuck in this kind of narrow lane of who they think God should be. And we all get in that place sometimes too, I think. I think we all get in this place where we think God should be the one who's given me everything that I want, right? So show me a sign, because I'm being a good boy. I'm going to Tuesday morning Bible study. I'm going to church. I'm reading the Bible. I'm doing all this stuff. God, you show me a sign that you're real. But really what we're saying is, I want this. So God, I want you to give it to me. That's the sign I'm looking for. And that's what's going on here. Jesus wants nothing to do with it. He gets back in the boat. He goes to the other side. He starts this conversation with the disciples. Beware the yeast of the Pharisees. We're in verse 14 here. Jesus' disciples had forgotten to bring any bread. So they only had one loaf with them in the boat. He gave them strict orders. Watch out, be on your guard for the yeast of the Pharisees as well as the yeast of Herod. The disciples discussed among themselves, he said this because we have no bread. Jesus knew what they were discussing and said, why are you talking about the fact you don't have any bread? Don't you grasp what has happened? Don't you understand? Are your hearts so resistant? Or in the Greek, are your hearts so hardened? Are your hearts so hardened to what God is doing? Don't you have eyes? Why can't you see? Don't you have ears? Why can't you hear? Don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves of bread for the 5,000? How many baskets full did you gather? They said 12. And when I broke 7 loaves of bread for the 4,000, how many baskets did you gather? 7. Jesus said to them, you still don't understand? You ever been in calculus class before? And the teacher's got all this stuff on the board, and he's exasperated. You don't get this? You don't understand this? You don't get that, like, 5 plus 2 equals 12, and that 7 plus a few equals 5? What's the matter with you guys? 12 equals 7 and 7 equals 5? What, you don't get it? Does anybody in here get it? Yeah. So Jesus, you saw last chapter 7, Jesus is getting kind of frustrated. And I think this is, like I said, in chapter 7, when he was with the Syrophoenician woman, I think this is great because it shows us the very human side of Jesus. We tend to get so caught up with, and I think Dan talked about this in Mark chapter 6, we get so caught up with Jesus being divine and perfect, and Jesus was a human being. Jesus got frustrated when he was trying to give good news to people, and they just were not getting it because their hearts were hardened because they were expecting something very specific, right? Jesus is in the boat, and he says, beware the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. What does that mean? Yeast is basically Hebrew code for something negative, something that corrupts, right? I don't know if there's any bread makers in here, but, you know, when you put yeast, a little bit of yeast falls into the dough, and what happens? It spreads, it grows, because yeast is alive, right? I mean, yeast is a living organism. So if you give it some sugar, it's not going to just stay in that one little patch of dough you put it. It's going to move throughout the whole thing and infect the whole thing. And sometimes that's what we want. Sometimes we want bread that rises, right? Sometimes we don't. Jesus is saying, I have given you dough. I've given you good news. But if you're going to listen to other voices that are contrary to the gospel that I'm telling you, it's going to spread. If you're listening to the Pharisees, and if you're still hanging on to the kind of kingdom vision that the Pharisees are trying to sow in you, that's what's going to become your vision. If you're listening to the Herodians, and you're listening to the kind of message that they are trying to tell you that the kingdom of God is about, that's what's going to be your vision. It's a warning to pay attention to what are the contrary voices in our lives, in our ears, that are speaking a message different from the one we've heard from Christ. Okay? The Pharisees wanted a kingdom of God that was built on everybody having strict obedience and adherence to the law. That was their bread and butter, was law and order. the law and the prophets. And they thought the kingdom of God was fulfilled when everybody was following the letter of the law perfectly. The Herodians, they wanted to see the royal family reestablished and the class of the elite get back into their high order of things. They thought, let's kind of work with the Romans. Let's work with these oppressors a little bit. Maybe we can get a little bit for ourselves. Maybe they'll let us kind of pretend like we have a king and a royal family and an elite class, and we'll get what we want again. Society will kind of be back in the caste system that we think it should be. That's what the kingdom of God looks like. That's the message that they're sowing. Jesus is saying, you have to pay attention and pay attention and pay attention, because there's going to be so many voices in your life that are going to tell you something different than what I've been telling you. And it's going to sound attractive, it's going to sound good, but it's the opposite of what I'm telling you. And we have the same challenge, the same struggle today, right? We've got all sorts of voices from media and culture and all sorts of things telling us that this is what the good life is, guys. The good life is when you get this sort of job, maybe it's a kind of a prosperity gospel sort of thing where it's about getting all the good stuff that you want, that's what Jesus is here to do for you. If you'll just follow Jesus, he'll make sure that you've got all the things you've always wanted, right? Or it may be that if you just follow Jesus, you'll get to have this insular group where people who think differently from you can't get in. And you'll get to have this exclusive club that you've always wanted. And you'll get to belong to something that's really special, that you have to really earn to get in. Okay, that's why you should join the church and be a part of what Jesus is doing, because you'll get to be a part of this club. Those kind of messages are always out there. And they're in churches. And they're being shared by ministers. And Jesus is saying you've got to pay attention to the yeast of different messages. You've got to listen to what's contrary and call that out, and don't let that get root in you, because then it'll spread. It'll become what you're looking for. Okay? So he kind of goes through this thing where he's talking about yeast and bread, and he starts talking about the loaves and the numbers and all that again. And there are people who have offered up a lot of different ideas of what the numbers mean. The numerology stuff is something I always think is really interesting. I don't know how much I can really say, yes, this is the truth. It's kind of like, I don't know if people paid attention in the aftermath of Kobe's death and they were finding every single game score. They were like, look, 8 plus 4 plus this plus that equals 24. It was a game for Kobe. It's like, okay, well, like I can see how that gives you some solace and, some comfort, and to think or it could just be that math is kind of neat and you can make it do whatever you want it to do sometimes, But in here, I think what we're really kind of trying to see, what the main point is, whether we get into what the numbers mean or not, is Jesus is saying, what I did with the Israelites, what I did with the Hebrews, is the same thing I'm doing with the whole world. Don't you get it? That's what he's saying, is don't you understand what I'm doing? This isn't just a mission about your tiny little group. This is about redeeming and saving the entire world. That's the mission I'm on. And if you want to be a part of that, you've got to start opening your ears to that and closing your ears off to what you're hearing from everybody else. Does that make sense? That's kind of what the conversation's about here. They get to the other side of the lake. Verse 22, we'll pick up here. Jesus and his disciples came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to Jesus and begged him to touch and heal him. Taking the blind man's hand, Jesus led him out of the village, and after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on the man, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" The man looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees, only they're walking around." Then Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes again. He looked with his eyes wide open. His sight was restored, and he could see everything clearly. Then Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't go into the village," which is basically his way of saying, don't tell anybody. Jesus and his disciples went into the villages near Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "What about you? Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ. You are the Messiah." Jesus ordered them not to tell anyone about him. All right, so if you were here a couple weeks ago, you remember I was talking about how these healings are kind of shifting a little bit. In the beginning, we were seeing healings that were really about kind of paralyzed bodies. They were about broken bodies, right? We make this shift in chapter 7 and 8 to kind of these healings of the senses. He healed in chapter 7 a deaf, mute man. Here we see him healing a blind man. And as I said, I hope that people are learning kind of how to do this with the gospel. The stories aren't in here by happenstance, right? They're not just in here to show us some kind of neat things that Jesus did along the way. all of this stuff means something beyond just the small details of the story. So when we hear about Jesus healing the deaf, the mute, and the blind, what we are meant to kind of think about here is that what Jesus is doing is he's coming into a world of people who thought that they were not allowed to hear God's voice. If you heard God's voice, you would die. If you spoke God's name, you would die. If you saw God's face, you would die. This is kind of the world that he's entering. Basically, this world that has put God so far away from them that they can't have a relationship with God. God is coming in and healing kind of that understanding of God is what he's doing here. So in this scene here, we see him healing a blind man, and it happens in these two stages. Okay? And I want you to think about it in context of what's wrapped around the healing of the blind. We have the Pharisees, who are the hard-hearted. They are blind. Then we have this question, who do people say that I am? Well, some say that you're Elijah, or some say that you're John the Baptist reincarnated. Some say you're one of the prophets. That's kind of the people who are sort of getting a sense of it, right? It's like the blind man who says, I see people, but they look like trees walking around. So we've got these people who are sort of getting the idea that, okay, Jesus he's more than just a regular guy. He's more than just the rabbi. But they're not quite all the way to what Peter's confession here at the end is, which is what? You are the Messiah, right? So you have someone here whose eyes are fully opened. And we'll see in a second that they're only fully open for about 3 seconds. And then Peter goes back to being a moron and doesn't get it, which is okay, because that's all of us too. We're all Peters. We're all kind of moronic and we don't quite get it, but Jesus hangs in there with us and gives us something to do, right? Jesus believes in us. So we have this healing of the blind man is not just a neat trick that Jesus did to remind us once again that he's a special guy. It's a way of saying, hey, look, there are the blind who can't see what Jesus is doing. There are those who have a pretty good idea, who are like, Jesus is somebody, I'm interested in. I don't quite know that I don't quite believe he's the savior of the world, but yeah, he's a good teacher, right? All right, so there's people who sort of get it. And there's a lot of people in churches who kind of believe that, right? Jesus is a good teacher. I come because I like kind of his moral ethics and I want to become a better person. Okay. And then you have Peter say he's the Messiah. Jesus, you're the Christ. You're the Messiah. And that's, remember, what Mark is all the gospel writers are having to argue their case for why this individual who ultimately we know will die, be crucified, how he can be the Messiah. Peter is convinced in this moment you're the Messiah. But what's the kind of Messiah Peter's convinced that Jesus is? We'll see here in the next verse here when Jesus starts to talk about the kind of Messiah he is. This isn't the Messiah that Peter was hoping for, right? Jesus began to teach his disciples, in the Greek it says, Jesus began to teach his disciples a new thing. The human one, the Son of Man, must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders, chief priests, legal experts, and be killed, and then after 3 days rise from the dead. He said this plainly. Okay, this isn't a parable, this isn't a metaphor. He's saying this is who I am and this is what's going to happen. He said this plainly. But Peter took hold of Jesus and, scolding him, began to correct him. Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, then sternly corrected Peter. Get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking God's thoughts, but human thoughts. After calling the crowd together with his disciples, Jesus said to them, all who want to come after me must say no to themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. All who want to save their lives will lose them, but all who lose their lives because of me and because of the good news will save them. Why would people gain the whole world but lose their lives, lose their souls? What will people give in exchange for their souls, for their lives? Whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this unfaithful and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of that person when he comes in the Father's glory with the holy angels. So remember, Peter gets it. You're the Messiah. But here's Peter's Messiah. He's expecting Jesus is going to lead a military victory. We talked about this way back in chapter 1. Jesus is going to lead a military victory. He's going to drive out the Romans. This is great. Jesus is going to be a king. He's going to reestablish God's reign in Israel. We are going to be the nation of God again. And then finally, he's going to rebuild the temple. He's going to reestablish that way that we have always interacted with God, which is through sacrifices and prayers and all that sort of stuff. He's going to rebuild the temple. That's the Messiah that Peter, in that moment, when he says, "You're the Messiah," that's what he's talking about. And then what does Jesus say? Here's what's going to happen to me. You think I'm going to lead a military victory? I'm going to suffer defeat. I'm going to suffer. You think I'm going to be a king and reestablish God's reign? I'm going to be rejected by everybody who would be the ones to put me in the throne. I'm going to be rejected by everybody. You think I'm going to rebuild the temple? No, the temple of my body is going to be destroyed and killed. So, imagine somebody comes and says they're going to run for president. And you get to know them, and you love their ideas, you love their vision, you're like, this is the guy. And then he tells you what his strategy for becoming president is. We're not going to have any money for our campaign. We're going to lose every single primary. And then on election night, we're not going to get one single vote. But then 3 days after that, we're going to go to Washington, D.C. and show up at the White House and declare victory. That's my strategy. Who's in? Peter's whole idea of what God is supposed to do, Jesus unravels it. And I think that's important because I think every time we start to build an idea of who we think Jesus should be, I hope Jesus comes in some way and unravels that for us. And he continues to go on, right? He calls him Satan not because he's demonic, not because he is Satan, but because really kind of Satan in the Gospel of Mark and in most of the Gospels really doesn't stand for this kind of devil the way we think about it. It stands for anything opposed to what God is doing. That's demonic. That's satanic. It's anything that's opposed to the mission that Jesus has set himself on. So what Jesus is saying is he's basically saying, Peter, if you're not hearing me on this, then you have taken the opposite side. You have become my enemy. You have become the Satan, the accuser in my life. Let me tell you what it's like to follow me. We're not moving towards a military, political, and religious victory. I'm asking you to take up your cross. I'm asking you to give up your life. I'm asking you to let go of everything you think is so important and to hold on to me and let me show you what true life really looks like. That's what Jesus is calling all of us into. And I don't know what you were, maybe you grew up in the church and so you never really had to make this decision. It was just kind of something that you've always been carried along through. But you think about the kind of people who maybe didn't grow up as followers of Christ or as followers of any religion, and how do they usually get pitched what it's like to be a follower of Jesus? A lot of times people are told, you know what, if you just follow Jesus, Jesus will fix all your problems. It'll be great. You really just need, I've heard this so many times. You hear about somebody who's struggling with something or whatever, and people will say, oh, they just need Jesus. As if Jesus is going to be the one to come in and fix everything for them and then give them everything that they've really been wanting their whole life. Give them a good job and a good home and a nice car and a retirement plan. That's not what Jesus says is going to happen when you follow him. You know, Jesus is, if your view of life, I think what Jesus is saying here is if your view of life is that it's temporary, that it's under threat, that it's something that you have earned and are in control of, then you are always going to fight to preserve it at all costs. You are going to hoard and cheat for yourself to make sure that you're in a good place, and you're going to see everybody else as an enemy. You're going to see everybody else as someone who might take away the good life from you, if that's how you view life, as something that you need to hold on to and protect and preserve. What Jesus is saying is, my way, if you follow me, you get to see life as eternal. You get to see life as a gift. You get to see life as a part, your life is a part of the life that God has given everybody. And if you begin to see it that way, then you're going to become a person of peace instead of a person who's fighting and looking at the world as a threat. You're going to become a person of peace. You're going to be someone who's open to give your life away, but also to receive what other people have to give. You're going to become somebody who sees everybody in your midst as a brother or a sister. That's the kind of life that Jesus is calling into. It's not about getting good stuff. It's about living the godly life. And so that's what we've got some time here to talk about around the table, some questions that come up from this series of events with Jesus. So we'll take the next 25 minutes here and talk around the tables together, okay?